HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mutations, The Many Strange Faces of Hardcore Punk by Sam Mcpheeters. Foreword by Toby Vale. Read by Sam Mcpheeters. For Tolga and Okun, thanks again. You can't stop people who are never embarrassed by themselves. Norman Mailer. Foreword by Toby Vale. Mutations is an anti-memoir by an unsentimental participant of hardcore punk, written during an era when nostalgia for the late 20th century sells out music venues and festivals on a daily basis, and autofiction is trending in the publishing industry. Instead of writing a glorified heroic narrative of his own life story told in the predictable chronological order through a narcissistic psychological lens, Sam Mcpheeters has chosen to reflect on his memories and experiences in their specific cultural context in ways that not only illuminate our understanding of the past, but also encourage us to reflect on how history shapes our own lives and has created the current political moment. This is refreshing and also in character, as Sam is an outsider who is definitely not capable of being trendy, is a staunch contrarian, and has never been one to approach a creative work with a market-driven motive such as selling books. As a look at his total body of work quickly shows, he's not in it for the money. Which brings us to the first question you may be asking yourself as you browse the new bookshelf at your local independent bookseller, or perhaps unearth a dusty copy of this relic in a public library years from now. Who is Sam Mcpheeters? If you know, and you can skip this part. But if you don't know, or even if you do, you are in luck, as this book will answer that question in depth. But first, allow me to introduce you to the guy, as he is an old pen pal of mine from the 1990s when we were both active in what he insists on calling hardcore punk, and I, like our mutual friend Aaron Cometbus, prefer to call underground music. We met when Sam was singing for one of the only good political hardcore bands that I knew about at the time, Born Against, and I was playing drums for Bikini Kill, a feminist punk group that was actively trying to reinvent both feminism and punk to be more inclusive of young women. Sam mentions our memorable first encounter when both bands briefly toured together in his essay on the Casual Dots, so I'll skip that here, and he is emblematically self-deprecating about how we eventually became friends despite an initial fissure between our scenes, which intersected and clashed, but really it makes sense. We are ultimately both self-reflexive fanzine nerds who take things way too seriously, tend to get stressed out and obsessive about music and its surrounding culture to the point of neuroses, and found a way to escape the existential horror of the world using bands and fanzines as cultural tools to overcome the mundane limitations of everyday life under capitalism. Our friendship was documented and preserved in the letters we wrote each other back then, which I still have, and they are funny little time capsules now. For example, on November 23, 1993, Sam wrote, "It was very good and surprising to get a letter from you. I had actually assumed that everyone in Bikini Kill hated us on account of some fanzine weirdness 2 years ago. I guess not." Born Against had just moved to Richmond, Virginia from New York City, finding themselves in a geographically isolated insular punk scene, similar to the one I had recently returned to in Olympia after Bikini Kill had been living in Washington, D.C. for a year and a half. At that moment, we both felt like exiles from scenes we had helped create and were trying to start over. I had written to Sam's label Vermiform asking if they wanted to advertise in my fanzine Jigsaw. Sam declined, claiming that funds were low, but this was the beginning of a lengthy correspondence that lasted for several years, and by early '94, after becoming trusted confidants, he did submit an ad to Jigsaw. I don't remember exactly what the beef was between our two groups, but we wrote it off as a non-controversy at the time of our reconnection. I valued Sam's support of Bikini Kill from that moment on, as he perceptively assured me that Born Against had gone through a microversion of what Bikini Kill went through, namely, people adopting rigid interpretations of what they thought the band's approach or attitude or whatever was supposed to be, and often making wrong, mean-spirited assumptions about us as a kind of punk caricature. At the time, most guys I knew in bands were definitely not actively going out of their way to support feminist punk, and what has become known as Riot Grrrl was widely hated, actively demonized, and generally misunderstood as man-hating or separatist, neither of which was actually 100% true or false. Obviously, it was more nuanced, specific, and varied than that. But most people didn't get that far because they had ideological blinders on that amounted to fingers in their ears. They couldn't hear us, we couldn't reach them, yet we wouldn't go away. Despite incessant, non-consensual mainstream media coverage, we were basically invisible and yet punished for simply existing, refusing to conform to society's bullshit rules about what young women could and couldn't do with their bodies in public space. This is what it's like to be a woman trying to have a voice under patriarchy, and punk was no exception. Sam will be the first to admit that he didn't necessarily get any of that right away, but eventually he opened his ears and tried to hear us, and I was grateful for his support. That is the kind of person he is, a tolerant, critical thinker who listens and tries to figure out what things mean beyond appearances, and pushes past the status quo to gain a counter-hegemonic understanding of culture and politics. Bringing us to the next question you might have as you start to listen. Why listen to this book? We are currently living in a different time period than the one discussed in this book, as Sam's focus is mostly on the years of his involvement in hardcore punk, which took place from 1984 to 2004. Since that time, we have entered a period of what he aptly calls taste fragmentation. Punk has not ceased to exist, and in fact, it could be argued that hardcore is more popular than ever before and no less viable as a cultural tool that empowers young people to have a voice and connect with each other outside of the music industry. In the past 10 years, women, queers, people of color, and trans kids have moved from the margins to the center of hardcore. There are hardcore punk festivals all over the world that new and old bands play. And as an evolving art form, the scene is arguably more all ages than ever before, as the kids in 80s bands grew up and they weirdly didn't quit playing in bands, and you can still see bands like Negative Approach on tour. Yet there are also many new groups everywhere. I don't pretend to understand any of the nuances of Egg and Chain as an old punk, but Sam didn't even know about mean punk until a few months ago when I asked him about it. His response was classic Sam. Any explanation would ruin this, so I didn't bother to try to decode it for him. So what do us old guys have to say that could be of interest or use to the next generation? I really don't know, but this book is hilarious, amazingly well written, and asks deep probing questions about the nature of consciousness. Is it a solitary experience? Whether or not music is actually communal, and what it all means. If you need specifics, this book contains the most extensively well-researched piece on Doc Dart from the Crucifix that I have ever read, amazing insights on Die Kreuzen and Discharge, and celebrates one of the greatest bands in modern memory, the Casual Dots. If that sounds intriguing, you are in for a wonderful treat. Since dropping out of the scene in 2004, Sam has focused on writing fiction, and this book demonstrates a very skilled command of language. His sentences are beautifully constructed. I laughed out loud several times reading this book to the point of tears. I argued with his conclusions and bizarre opinions. In no way is the Age of Quarrel LP better than the demo, sorry. But I was deeply entertained and engaged with every single sentence of this book. It is a good one. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Preface. For 20 years, I immersed myself in aggressive underground music. I never considered myself a punk rocker or even a punk, although this was obviously the turf on which I operated. Even now, I'm still trying to make sense of the nuances and mutations of this subculture. It hasn't gotten simpler with hindsight. Punk isn't a porous subject. It's completely fluid. Writing about it in any meaningful way is like trying to document one particular part of a lake. For example, the word itself has no set definition. Depending on who and where you are, punk can be a lifestyle, cosplay, design element, powerful ideal, lazy cliché, magical realism, badge of authenticity, pantomime social movement, withering mockery, ironclad conviction, lucrative career, vow of slovenly poverty, incubator of brilliance and or mediocrity, rite of passage, riot of violence, ferocious hokiness, suicide hotline, sales category, community glue, license to wallow, mass catharsis, a refuge for smart people and or playground for dumb people, boisterous escapism, marketable nostalgia, belligerent incompetence, self-satire, intentional or otherwise, assault on falseness, or adult-sized psychic diapers that can be worn until death. And if someone has a strong belief about what it is, odds are they have an even stronger opinion about what it is not. How can so many people pledge allegiance to something with no fixed meaning? And yet pledge they do, generation after generation, identifying with a musical subgenre so powerful that it has the ability to change listeners' identities. I intersected this world through hardcore, the hardcore version of punk rock. Starting with the Dead Kennedys tape I bought in 1984 and ending with the last show I played live in 2004, I tried to sample every possible expressive outlet within this subculture. I fronted 3 bands, one, Born Against, that got a lot of attention within its circuit, and 2 more, Men's Recovery Project and Wrangler Brutes, that did not. Between one bungled night as a college radio DJ and 15 years of touring, I also made fanzines, booked shows, ran a record label, co-owned a record store, and designed my fair share of merchandise and ephemera. For years, hardcore punk was the best game in town, despite the consensus that its golden age lasted from 1980 to 1986. So I never outran the feeling that the scene's finest days had ended just as I'd gotten in. Entering this subculture in the wrong year, however, gave me an odd bird's-eye view of its central players. Many of them had moved on by the time I'd signed up, but they were never that far away. I had access to most of the people who'd immediately preceded me, a bit of fortunate timing for which I will always be grateful. I've now spent as much time outside this world as I did as a touring band member. Many of punk's battles against white supremacy or the eternal churn of leftist infighting have migrated to the national stage. A much larger, less defined battle against the forces of mass insanity also looks increasingly familiar. The more time passes, the less the whole thing feels like nostalgia than it does a prelude. But to what exactly? Sam Mcpheeters, October 2019. Section 1. Questions. Networking under the ESP station. What do people even write? In 1978, the state of New York completed the Empire State Plaza, ESP, a 100-acre government complex dominating the skyline of the capital city, Albany. The plaza's 44-story tower building, seemingly named in the grand, bland tradition of Soviet architecture, loomed over the nearby Mansion Hill like a conquering spaceship. When I moved to the neighborhood that same year, it was still an enclave of old Italian families, remnants of the Little Italy obliterated to make room for the gleaming new behemoth. Klieg lights kept the tower building luminous after dark. When it snowed, the night sky glowed with power. The plaza's multi-level concourse served as a vast playground for my kid self, 100-acre woods of concrete, marble, and glass I was allowed to roam alone. With its colossal corridors and brutalist architecture, the plaza looked like the kind of place one would go to receive further instructions, which is what it became. Opening a mailbox in its tiny post office, the ESP station was one of my first grown-up acts. After getting dumped in 11th grade, I washed dishes 7 days a week and somehow saved enough to buy a pea-green 1974 Chevy Impala with vinyl bench seats the size of church pews. My high school was off the highway, and the highway cut through the ESP parking levels. After school, I would park underground, grab my mail upstairs, then read letters and listen to tapes in the Empire State Plaza's upper parking level. It was here, in the diving bell privacy of the Impala, using my massive car dashboard as a desktop, that I first reached out into the wider world. I had nothing to sell, no persona to advance, no grudges to stoke. I just liked getting mail. I perused pamphlets from the Karen Carpenter fan club and Wiccans and Church of the Subgenius and Satanists. For a while I fielded replies from a bunch of teen girls who'd written to Archie Comics as kids in 1975 and were thus roughly my age. My best friend Jason and I had written each other that we were doing some sort of 10-year follow-up study. To meet girls? Although I have no idea how we got their home addresses. The Archie girls were, surprise, totally boring lamers who did not like my favorite band, the Cro-Mags. But I did snag a pen pal who liked the Cro-Mags, a college girl from Sarah Lawrence I met in the personal ads of Flipside fanzine. I wrote a lot of people from fanzines. I didn't know it at the time, but I was entering something new and breathtakingly potent, the network of hardcore punk. Those two words weren't synonymous, but became entwined in ways that flattened them to outsiders. Punk tried to crack the code of the music industry. Hardcore never had that option. It would have been absurd for any major label to sign, or any radio station to play, loud, violent bands made up of loud, mentally ill people who gleefully sang about every possible taboo. The extremism of hardcore forced its fans to do everything themselves. The opportunity of hardcore was the same opportunity once offered by running off to join the circus. Horizontal ambition, not vertical. This was the chance to bypass the music industry altogether, to tour, release records, and network, to make music for its own sake, to have adventures for their own sake. The self-reliance of hardcore had American fingerprints all over it. The earliest versions of these networks, painstakingly built by just a handful of bands, channeled the energy of past spurts of American ingenuity, both cultural, Chautauqua, the Chitlin Circuit, 1960s underground media, and industrial, the sheer endurance required to clear and pave wilderness. The global success of hardcore punk has masked its identity as an American art form, one as homegrown as vaudeville, jazz, or rap. Oddly, the people who still pay reverence to this art form do so, I think, for largely personal reasons. Many people who submerge themselves in this subgenre describe it as one of the most positive experiences of their lives. Not many people recognize the rarity of a self-generated, self-reliant network, which is probably a tribute to the power of the art form and its sprawling network of music and literature and ideas rapidly spreading to every corner of Western civilization. I can pinpoint the moment I entered this network as a participant. For a homework assignment, I'd copied a chapter from the Federalist Papers in my school library. I included the cover because I liked the art, cartoony figures of three founding fathers loitering on the street like people outside a show. Its awkwardness, its offness, resembled the Raymond Pettibon drawings I had only recently learned to appreciate. All it needed was a creepy caption. I folded the pages and smiled in realization. I was holding what looked like a small photocopied magazine. What if I made my own small photocopied magazine? I'd done lots of little projects and cartoons and calendars as a child, including several copied comic books I forced on my relatives. I had no idea yet that fanzines were already an existing thing. In issue 1, I used the word as a joke, although I didn't quite get its meaning. Thus, Jason and I launched Wretched Fanzine. Wretched bypassed the burden of content by being mostly graphics. Jason drew comics, I made collages. Although the first issues were 80% him, he was a far better artist and writer. Each slender fanzine provides a tiny ice core sample of our shared tastes. Bible tracts and Book of Revelations quotes, drawings of skeletons and skateboarders, Archie comics, absurdist newspaper clippings, jokes about the Contras and the Challenger explosion, and CPR line art of boys performing mouth-to-mouth on each other with little cartoon hearts drawn around them, which, for the anti-gay 80s, seems oddly ballsy. My mom bought a Canon PC-14 to use for her own art. One of the first personal copiers, 8 pages a minute. It was too small and fragile for print runs, but perfect for making layouts and degrading the quality of graphics. By issue 4, I was 17 and driving, the P.O. box was open for business, and we were ready to start writing about things like a real fanzine. This point was a micro-crisis, as I had no idea what people wrote in real fanzines. The twin mediums of hardcore journalism, review and interview, seemed completely beyond me. I didn't know how to review records, and the idea of interviewing people from actual bands seemed as realistic as interviewing astronauts. I remember asking Jason the question out loud. What do people even write? I'd penned a few other bits for Wretched, but it didn't feel like these bits conformed to real zine standards. And as I got deeper into the scene, I wanted to make something more accessible to that scene. Issue 4 finally featured my first record review. Cro-Mags, Age of Quarrel LP, blazing NYHC sound combined with the best apocalyptic lyrics ever thought of make this the greatest record ever recorded. In fact, you will buy it. I'm not offering you a choice." I vaguely recalled not being thrilled with this review or any other piece of writing I did for a long time after. It took even longer to grasp that I was going to be doing a lot of bad writing, and that most of this writing would be done in public formats. It took a quarter century for me to realize I could just write things and not show them to anyone. This wasn't what we now think of as a readership, the infinity of online eyeballs that sees everything but only stripped of context. This was an actual audience, tiny but engaged, and one that could be coaxed to grow through nothing more than persistence. As I slowly learned how to write, I did so in a self-consciously public manner. Wretched begat Plain Truth, a real fanzine that interviewed real bands. Plain Truth begat Dear Jesus, the fanzine where I started to push a persona, that of an obnoxious, mentally ill hardcore band guy. After a bandmate expressed frustration with inaccuracies in a tour diary, I moved towards conspicuously falsified personal histories, impossible shows, fake backstories, dialogue with real-world celebrities I clearly did not know. In hindsight, these experiments were my first fumblings towards writing fiction, the same general path I'm on today. Back to the Empire State Plaza. One detail from those days glints with significance. Most correspondents would leave off the ESP station part of my new address. It took me a while to understand that many of the people I communicated with thought I was being needlessly weird. This became a theme of my adult life. The acute constraints of hardcore punk in all its formats, zines, bands, records, record labels, always struck me as challenges. The price of experimentation is failure, so I frequently missed the mark in my output and developed a reputation as someone being needlessly weird. This isn't a complaint, just an observation. There are worse reputations to get. The intensity of wrestling with ideas in public can often look ridiculous to those outside the process. At a certain point, I realized I was getting my mail anyway, so I simply ceased caring. Frozen Pits. Why be in a band? Not long after I'd called it quits as a performer, I drove into LA to catch a band I liked. My former band had played the same venue a few months earlier, spurring an on-stage panic attack. I'd managed to bluff my way through the set, but my confidence had taken a hit. Returning to this room felt like trying to resume a relationship after the kind of screaming blowout no relationship ever really recovers from. The headlining band played loud, aggressive music. At some point during their set, I shifted my gaze from stage to crowd. No one moved. No one did anything. I found myself surrounded by blank faces. Now it was the audience who were bluffing, and bluffing badly. I found myself wondering if music fans had always been so disengaged, if my own emotional investment in bands had blinded me to this mass disinterest. It was spooky. A week later, flipping through TV channels, I paused on a Foo Fighters concert. I'd arrived mid-song to find frontman Dave Grohl rocking out, one foot up on the monitor, wild mane of hair swooshing as he soloed with virile abandon. The entire spectacle was self-evidently absurd. Why wasn't he laughed off stage? The thought became a loose thread that, when tugged, led to an unraveling. Had I ever looked this piously pompous when performing? And if I could no longer summon faith in my own live music, how could I muster interest in anyone else's live music? I'd already known that I wouldn't be in any more bands. Now I realized I wouldn't be able to watch other bands. This change was so bizarre, so abrupt, it felt like a brain injury. Something that had overwhelmed my life for 20 years no longer made sense. I can remember those earlier emotions, the way live music was like fresh squeezed juice to the canned concentrate of a recording, but I can no longer feel them. There was a time when music made me submerge myself in mobs. Bands and songs were the drivers, but photography was the lure. Audiences were, and are, part of punk's sales pitch. The big visuals from this era are of stage divers. Photographer Ed Culver set the template with one infamous photo taken at an LA show in the early 80s. In Culver's picture, a stage diver in Vans and a sleeveless tee hovers 4 or 5 feet over the crowd, curled upside down like a human pill bug. Although the landing is clearly going to hurt, at least for the people below, the instant captured is strangely serene. A man floats, bystanders watch. Even today, the best stage diving photography follows Culver's template. People leaping from dangerous heights, visually isolated from the waiting throng. In loud 3D, stage divers plunge into crowds. As the title suggests, this slender, long out-of-print book on photography, self-published by Mike Arredondo, Rob Kulikovsky, and Gary Robert in 1984, comes with a pair of cheap cardboard glasses that convert each red and blue photo into a mesmerizing little still life. Every picture showcases that peculiar contradiction of pre-digital black and white 3D, pairing the distance of sepia with the immediacy of depth. A small glossary of visual info lost in traditional photography, texture, sweat, hollows of shadow, lends the photos a fascinating density. This collection of photos chronicles hardcore punk concerts, hardcore rock and roll, according to the book's cover, in San Francisco between 1982 and 1984, meaning the book covers the very best years of hardcore punk in a national hub for local and touring groups. Blue-chip bands, Black Flag, Minor Threat, Dead Kennedys, share space with forgotten acts, Sado Nation, Black Athletes, Stranglehold. Few books of music photography can match its urgency. Singers shriek and launch themselves at audiences, creating bizarre dioramas of feigned violence. In one picture, a stream of beer hangs in midair, connecting the hand of fuck-up singer Bob Noxious to the gaping mouth of a fan. In another photo, Dead Kennedys frontman Jello Biafra bestows water on outstretched arms, the droplets neatly suspended in zero gravity. Viewed without glasses, the guitarist of NYC's Cause for Alarm is apparently getting punched in the face. In 3D, the fist is shown jovially punching the air in front of him as he body slams his own instrument. Audience shots take up more than a third of the book. Slam dancers pose, halted in time, the billows of their plaid shirts suspended like puffs of smoke in an old stereoscope. One man seems to register shock that he has just been leapt upon. Another man puffs his cheeks out, as if a trap door had dumped him into a pit of writhing bodies. These hurtling, plunging, stampeding masses say more about the era than even the band shots. There is none of the indifference of modern concert-goers. These people seemed involved in an epic struggle with an eternally off-screen antagonist, their efforts closer to news footage than concert photography. On one page, the singer of Deadly Rain has been shot mid-mosh, high-stepping, arms swinging, his rollerball t-shirt ripped on both sides to expose strong, bare shoulders. The pose resembles Eugène Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. It is martial yet joyous, and oddly sensual. It looks like sexy propaganda. This book is full of good-looking young men striking poses for each other's enjoyment. Although bare male torsos were staples of early 80s hardcore photography, a certain amount of sexual energy evaporates in the physics of two dimensions. In the depths of these photos, men strut and flex and glisten in physical space. It's a sales pitch for a lifestyle brand. On the opposite page, we see Keith Brammer, bassist of Die Kreuzen, frozen in the throes of performance. This is early in the band's career. He must be playing very fast. Viewed flat, he is clearly a handsome young man. Seen in 3D, the viewer can discern the jut of his chin, the fullness of his lips, the distinct knob of his Adam's apple. He peers upward, over the photographer, through a mane of slick, wet hair. The look on his face could easily be mistaken for private adult sexy times. It's a theme. Sothera Feng from Crucifix, lithe and feline, arches backwards in his black tank top. Henry Rollins, half naked but not yet in his short shorts phase, bends towards the viewer like a Randy Stanley Kowalski. Fierce Li Ving mugs for the camera, looking like a bare-chested wrestler. The camera even catches Jello Biafra, shirtless and horizontal, exposing an upside-down cross shaved into the fur of a surprisingly taut stomach. The clear indentations of a six-pack are visible with the glasses. Where do the ladies stand with all this sexy stuff? There are so few it's hard to know. Women are vastly outnumbered in the world chronicled by Loud 3D. Halfway through the book, there is one nicely worded block of text from Mordum Records' Ruth Schwartz, who defends the scene from accusations of chauvinism with a level of maturity that is slightly jarring in its context. The generation of women in punk, 13 to 30 mostly, are the hardest working, most ardent feminists, humanists I've ever met, writes Schwartz. Most women I know are not just dealing with their oppression as females, but also as people. This is a step beyond the liberation and feminism our mothers.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?